Okay. So I think we can get started because we're kind of moving. It's 1:33, so I think we can get started. My name is Keelan Koning, and I'm the communications coordinator for 3CSN. And I'm just super excited. I also teach English at Cal State Northridge. I always forget to say that. And I'm super excited to have you all here today on a Friday. We know that Zoom fatigue is a real thing, and that we're all engaged in a lot of, I'm sure many of you are engaged in a lot of professional learning on your own campuses, right? As you take those hectic Canvas 80-hour experiences and such. And so, you know, as we're doing all those things, and I am too, I'm taking like 2 things and learning about rubrics and all this kind of stuff for the campuses. But in the midst of all this, to be able to come together and intentionally think about things is a real privilege and a joy. I mean, I think it's such an incredible thing, and we're just super honored that all of you have chosen to take your time today to be here. Also, if you are interested in getting flex credit for today, you would like that, then please email us at ask@3csn.org. and we can provide you with confirmation that you attended as well, so that you don't at the end of the year go, uh-oh, I was supposed to get that flex credit. Okay, that's what happens to me when I'm doing expense reports. So I just wanted to say, you know, in terms of our conversation about ungrading, and as we kind of move forward with our with our journey through ungrading with Jennifer Escobar, from Moreno Valley College, who we are just so honored to have with us, with all of her incredible generosity today. And she's going to introduce herself in a minute. But it's just a really pivotal moment for us to think about the way that we as students, and also it could bring a lot more joy to our lives. Jennifer and I were just talking, actually, that's how I lost track of time before I clicked on the admit all, because we were just chatting about how right now, you know, this is a time when we have the opportunity to really consider our grading practices and how we can support students and how we can employ, you know, these anti-racist practices, because, you know, as we know, there are parts of the institution that aren't always designed for all of our students. And so this is a great opportunity for us all. So without further ado, Jennifer, take it away.
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much, Keelan, for that introduction, and also for providing this space for us to learn together. I am just celebrating my first week off of work, but like many of you, I'm also still working in many ways to think about how to improve my educational practices, both in my classroom and at my college, for our students as we face a number of crises that are, you know, ongoing and not going to end in terms of us going back in the summer or the fall or whenever you're teaching next. So I wanted to just start, I was feverishly working on revising today's session because I came across a couple more resources. Ungrading is receiving a lot of attention in different, well, definitely higher ed. So I wanted to include those. So I hope that the Google Doc is not as messy as I suspect it might be. So we'll go ahead and get started. And I have a quote from a resource that I found this last week. It's one of the ones I want to make sure I included today. Susan Bloom, who's a professor of anthropology and has written a wonderful book about I love learning, I hate school, and she's looking at experiences of students. So a lot of the resources I cite are either hyperlinked, or you'll find also at the very, very end a resources section that has some of the things I cite, but also if you wanted to explore further as well. So in the podcast, this will be an option you can listen to during the session today. She has this quote: "I'm inviting you to throw away something that might seem like the most fundamental dimension of our teaching, grades. We can throw out grades and keep learning." So we'll talk more about that, the relationship between learning and our classroom and our grading system. So you can see the agenda there today. Again, this is a Google Doc. It's meant to be interactive. So I'm inviting everybody at a lot of different points today to share their thoughts on the Google Doc itself. This is the second of three parts for 3CSN during June and July. My first session was focused on assessments and assignments, not so much thinking of the classroom syllabus level. So you'll see a little bit of that just to provide a framework and a starting point, but the goal of today's session is to really think about how to apply ungrading within the entire class. So yeah, I want to go ahead and also just have some starting thoughts and suggestions for today. If you prefer to have I am so glad some of you have your cameras off. I welcome that. But I also was trying to work and attend webinars with my 3 kids running around in the background. So I had my camera off. So I totally understand if you don't want to put it on, that's fine. Don't feel pressured to do that. And of course, I'll keep mine on. And you might even see a star appearance from one of my children. So do whatever's comfortable for you. The document itself is meant to be interactive. So if you have something you want to comment on in the Google Doc, feel free to do that. There's points where I actually will say, yeah, please go ahead. But if you see like an idea or you have a question, you can always just type in the Google Doc itself as well. And hopefully that encourages everybody to like interact with each other. Also be okay that I'm completely uncomfortable with talking about grading, but I've been doing this for several years with my colleagues, with my local K-12 districts, Riverside County Office of Ed. I participated in a grading policy forum that they had a couple of years back, but I've had this conversation not just in my discipline and department, but also school-wide, different professional developments, now more recently the last year or so with 3CSN. So it is a little uncomfortable to talk about grading because I think it's very personal, and I'll talk a little bit about my own grading journey, but the goal again of today is to reflect on our practices with the goal of finding what our next step might be in terms of grading in your own syllabus. Keep learning and equity at the heart of this conversation and this session. So as Bloom says, you know, we want students to keep learning. Grading is not always the best motivator for that. It maybe doesn't do the things we hope it does. And so she'll offer suggestions and others will offer suggestions for doing that as well. There's going to be points where I encourage people to share aloud. If you would love to, please go ahead. If not, if you're like me and I was like always like, no, I'm not going to share, don't feel like you have to do that. We'll have other opportunities to share aloud as well. You're welcome to share this Google Doc with others. There's a lot of hyperlinks in there. I'm kind of hyperlink happy these days. So it's meant to for you to return back to it and even see some practices that your colleagues are suggesting. And if this came up in a couple of the sessions about data and research, so this is, I've done the data and the research presentations, this is not really it. If you want to talk about data and research, especially my field within composition and rhetoric, I'm happy to talk about that or send docs, or even I've included some of those resources at the end of this document. This session is more about kind of practical classroom approaches. And so it kind of assumes, all right, you're already interested in ungrading and what you might be able to do with it in summer, fall, or just whenever you're teaching next. So we're going to go ahead and jump in. So many of you are already there. So let's take another minute or two. It's on page 2. What do you hope to learn today? So your name, your discipline, department, your institution, and what you hope to learn, or if you have a question about today's topic. So let's just take another minute to do. All right, so the next session that we're doing is going to be focused on talking about grading with colleagues. So I'm going to practice a little bit of what I found, what's something that's really important to me. I identify as Mexican American, grown up in Southern California, lived here all my life. And I think for me, what I've understood, especially one, I just knew it just growing up and experiencing it, but also being much more intentional in my understanding of the role of storytelling within rhetoric, is being able to tell our stories and be aware of kind of how we learn certain practices. So I'm just going to briefly share, hopefully briefly, share my own kind of grading journey. So I was jotting down some ideas before today's session because I thought it would be important. So I've heard, I'm looking at the comments and I'm hearing a lot of people just kind of here to learn just generally what ungrading is. Maybe it's connection to equity, into anti-racism, which as we know is a result of the protests in response to the death of George Floyd and others. A lot of people are trying to understand how these different situations and systems are engaging in racist practices. And so for me, I think that's really important. I appreciate people putting that on there. I definitely have come to understand grading as another system that can reproduce, but also disrupt racism within and racial disparities in higher education. So I'll just share briefly what my own understanding of this from my own journey as an educator. When I was in 4th grade, I took a GATE test and I was assessed into GATE. I went to school during the 80s and 90s, which really was, there's heavy tracking where I grew up. So that pretty much put me on the honors and AP track for my entire college career. I went to a high school in San Bernardino County, and this was very, as I studied it later, as an educator and somebody who was trying to improve my own practice, I didn't realize it at the time, but I saw it. But 50% of the freshmen of my high school were pushed out. Oh, thank you, Keelan, for clarifying that. So 50% of the students, and mostly it was working class, Latinx students, some white, some Black students, were pushed out by the time they got to senior year. And a lot less of us actually went on to higher education 4-year or 2-year after that. And so I benefited from early academic outreach program through my local UC Riverside. It was the only college I applied to. I really didn't understand how to navigate college. There were definitely a lot of benefits. My mom barely, as she says, barely graduated high school. She went back to Valley College. I see somebody from San Bernardino Valley College. And went to Valley College in her 40s and later finished her college degree. And my dad had also accessed higher ed through community college as well. And so I was pushed, into UCR. I was happy. I was really excited about going there. I became a high school teacher. I taught for 10 years at a local high school. And I saw some of these practices reproduced. I learned, although I have a teaching credential, I never learned grading as part of my credentialing program. I just kind of absorbed whatever everybody else was doing. And I've seen a similar kind of phenomenon at the community colleges where I've worked, and now I work in Moreno Valley College, where we try to be very intentional about talking about grading, which is very uncomfortable. As if you've ever talked about grading with others, it can spur a lot of conversations. And then I was hired as I started as an adjunct at a couple local community colleges. Then I was hired at Moreno Valley College in my first year of the tenure review process. I had already been looking at different research within my field, and I decided, okay, I'm going to finally make the jump. I was terrified to do it as a first year on my tenure review, but I went into using contract grading. So I see somebody mention contract grading, and the explicit reason why I did that is because the research in that particular area is very thorough about how contract grading in particular can improve and has improved outcomes, improving equitable outcomes. And so the studies that I was looking at were looking primarily with Black students among students at Cal State Fresno's first year writing program. So for me, it was like, okay, I wanted to understand a little bit more how and why. And since then, I've been giving a lot of different PDs and engaging in conversations as an assistant chair or as a colleague. But I really encourage people to have the conversations, but also to start making those small steps that can really improve our outcomes for all of our students, especially those who have been historically marginalized within higher education. So thank you very much for listening to my story. So I was like, where do I start that story? And I thought I have to start it as a student when I was going through school. So thank you so much.
Jennifer, we had a couple of quick questions. Sorry to interrupt. So Heather wanted to know a little more about push outs. Could you
Yeah,
explain that a little?
absolutely. So I tend to use this when we're talking about dropping out versus pushing out. It's another way to understand that the systems may be pushing students out of a system, right? Rather than students like, I think of my cousin, I don't know, like I guess 12, 13-year-old freshman, right? Choosing to drop out. When we look at the data, we look at the research, it's more that they're pushed out of the system in different ways. So that's why I use that term.
Yeah, and that sometimes I know, like with pregnant teens, sometimes that happens, right? They're strongly encouraged, like, oh, it's going to be so hard for you to continue on.
Yeah,
Uh,
and
yeah.
Michael, thank you for
Yes.
asking. No, I went to UC Riverside. I went straight to UCR. Mhm. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and jump in, and I think if you are interested in talking about grading with colleagues, I do really promote storytelling, kind of thinking of your own story about how you learn grading practices. My journey is not over, it's changing all the time, and it definitely was put under pressure during the pandemic, and when thankfully I already used ungrading entirely in my course. So I always was focused on just like, don't worry about the grade. This is what we need to keep learning about as we finish this course this term. I want you to take a look at page 3, Introduction to Ungrading. And there's 2 different resources there. The first one is a podcast I just came across, Susan Bloom, who I reference in different places throughout this document and session. And the second option, and I wanted to include option 2 because there's not a transcript for option 1. So I want to make sure that you have something that's accessible. And so option 2 is another commonly cited scholar about ungrading, Jesse Stommel, so how to ungrade. I'm going to ask for you to just take, let's take 12 minutes, and that'll include about 9 minutes to read or to listen, and then 3 minutes at the end to write your responses to the prompt up there. So it's, what did you learn about ungrading? How does it connect with what you already knew? What questions do you now have? Right, so we'll take 12 minutes, so about 9 minutes to read or to listen, and then 3 minutes to write in the space provided. All right, does anyone want to share their thoughts, whether it's something that you wrote or are wondering about, or something you saw somebody else write?
I appreciated Susan's comment about, maybe trying out one assignment versus having to do like the whole course, and I'm trying to move myself in that direction to invite my students to be part of that development of assessment. I think that's probably one of the more challenging aspects of trying to get them to help create without making it feel as if, okay, so how did I do on this? What grade did I get?
And do you mean, Michael, and just so I'm understanding, do you mean that they're still kind of, you don't want them to focus on the grade? You want them to focus on the
Yeah, I think if it's something which we're trying to create maybe for an assignment, and I'll probably start off with one assignment as being sort of ungraded, but something that can be sort of an approach. If they're there to help with creating maybe the assignment and also the assessment, how to do that without them getting caught up in saying, well, how much of my grade is based on what I just participated in, right? And so I guess I'm struggling with the idea of, is that possible to just maybe do one assignment, or if I buy into ungrading, I need to do it for the entire course?
Yeah, Cindy, let me unmute you there. Oh, you got it. All right, perfect.
Got it. Yeah, in response to Michael, I've used this strategy. I was surprised. I've actually used a lot of the ungrading strategies before. I just didn't know that's what it was called. But I really love having my students help create the rubric for an assignment. But I found that it works best to start with giving them a rubric for the first assignment, so they understand what it looks like and how it works. And we analyze the rubric and we use it to against a sample student assignment to kind of work together through it, so that they kind of have that process under their belt before then the next assignment, then I have them help. I have them work in groups. We do it together. So each group takes one component of the rubric and creates what they think that would look like. What would a good example of this look like? And really describing some of those elements. And then we bring all the groups back together and they share their rubric so that by the end you have a full rubric and they've explained it and they've worked together on it. And then they use that to do some peer feedback for each other as well as self-assessment. And then in the next assignment, then I have them do a little more independent type of creation of a rubric, and then we share as a class, we agree on everything. So that's just kind of how I've worked through it, and it's worked really well because it created a lot more metacognitive awareness and in the students about really thinking through what was needed in that assignment to make it have the qualities and the characteristics that we had learned about, whatever the topic was.
Okay, great. Thank you, Cindy.
I love it. Thank you so much, Cindy and Michael. So we're going to go into page 5 and you'll see a chance to dive a little bit deeper. Some of the same, there's the same documents plus a couple more on there. And I'd like for you, we're going to just participate in this again and really just kind of lay some foundational understanding of what ungrading is. Because again, as Cindy said, you know, she had used it, but maybe it wasn't called the same thing. And I've only known of the term maybe for the last few years, although maybe it's been around longer. And I was introduced to it in part by the California Acceleration Project, which really pushed for writing courses to perhaps have like the first 1 or 2 assignments or essays ungraded, meaning that the students just have to complete them, but they're not actually given a letter score or a letter grade. So, you know, this approach is not new necessarily, but maybe the terminology is. So thank you, Cindy, for bringing that up. And Michael, thank you for posing that question. But let's go ahead and you can pick from a variety of different sources. There's one additional podcast. So again, a lot of this stuff is just from this last month. The first option is really, really helpful. And I've tried to include the minute approximations for the different speakers. So it's a panel. And then you'll also see Jesse Stommel's work. You'll see option 3, being very mindful that STEM faculty may want to also use this approach. It is something that I've seen in different forums. Again, my expertise is more in comp rhetoric, but as I've been working outside of my discipline, I'm always looking for examples in different publications. So option 3 is there, and then the podcast that was already mentioned is option 4. So you're welcome to review what you just listened to, finish it, or skip around as needed. So we're going to take about 10 minutes. And so about 7 minutes to read or listen, and then 3 minutes to write. All right, would anyone like to share their thinking so far on these topics? I saw some of you just finish the podcast. You might have looked at the chemistry article. So what are your thoughts at this point?
I'll go. My name is Andrea. I really, you know, I was reading the STEM assignment, and then I also, and sorry to name call out, but I read Stephanie's comment, and I really liked it because I was thinking the same in regards to not having these grades, but then having the students assess themselves and having to figure out the right answer, which I like that assignment too. But then when you wrote that, Stephanie, Stephanie was saying that some students may feel like maybe they're not good enough now. You know, I couldn't solve that problem. I can't even find that answer, you know, and then you have all that. So I kind of liked how Stephanie brought up that topic too, because it can go both ways for a student. And it is having those open discussions. And I guess another instructor too, or professor, I'm sorry, commented too that they would like to see sample assignments. And I agree too, because I need to see how this would look, but not only that, but especially during COVID-19 when we're only doing online and we need to have these discussions with the students individually, that's a long time on top of, you know, teaching and when to meet with them and things like that. So I am curious how this looks. as I am really, really new to all of this.
Yeah, no, I completely appreciate you sharing that. And I was looking through these. I mean, I have some suggestions in terms of making sure that students just don't feel like they're flailing by themselves. But I will provide some sample assignments actually in the next portion. So please keep me accountable, Andrea and Stephanie, if you don't find, or whoever was mentioning needing some sample assignments, if you feel like you need a little bit more. I actually just cut something because I'm worried about time and I want to give us time to look at those assignments. Anyone else want to share? Oh,
Can I jump in here?
yeah, thank you.
My comment was brought up, and thank you. I'm glad that this was, you know, I'm not the only one thinking these things. I guess to kind of add to what was already talked about with the whole like asking students to be kind of self-sufficient. Like I worry that we're kind of pushing that cultural value on students, and I both am completely in favor of liberating students from these oppressive grading practices, but also am like concerned about those students who will find these other kinds of practices also oppressive, right? And maybe not feel comfortable coming up and asking for help or asking their peers for help. Yeah, so I would love to like hear from folks who have been able to address that in successful ways, or if anyone has any ideas or resources.
All right, thank you very much. Let's look at, and I'll make sure I loop back. I'm making notes on my little journal here to make sure I loop back to that. Let's take a look at page 7, where it says ideas for ungrading assignments. So there's a number of examples on pages 7, 8, and I think it goes into 9. And I'm just going to give you about 5 minutes to look through those and use the add comment feature. So for example, there's sample assignments for ungrading midterms. There, if you go on page 7, page 8 talks about grading one or a few things rather than grading everything. On page 8, it also cites David Gugler's work on the missing course and looking at different strategies for test quizzes or minimal markings. And then on page 9, and this is one I'm especially fond of, is, and I've been using it this last year after I read Susan Bloom's book, I Love Learning, I Hate School last year. During summer, I've included the self-evaluation, which is really common in composition courses. You might have a process or cover letter with an essay, but I liked the way she used the self-assessment. That seemed to be much more direct than what I was asking students to do. And so I use that for all of my essays that I assign, or all of my writing that I assign for my first year comp courses. And that's taken from her book. So take about 5 minutes just to skim at your leisure those different assignments. And then what I ask for you to do or invite you to do is go ahead and comment on and use the add comment feature. I have an explanation of how to do that on page 7. Different ideas or questions you have about those particular assignments. So let's just take 5 minutes to do that. All right, so I'm hoping that seeing those, I see lots of comments and responses, and I appreciate everybody engaging there. I'm hoping that provides a little bit more concrete ideas of assignments. And so again, this is part of why I didn't want to just jump into talking about the syllabus, because I think a lot of this groundwork needs to be laid in terms of understanding what ungrading is. To describe my own process, I use labor-based contract grading. And many of you mentioned Inouye's work. He's one of the people on the 3-person podcast. And I've used his particular method, although I have adapted it for my own classrooms and what I feel works best and have seen work best for my students, where students have a default grade of a B if they do all the work of the course. I don't put any letter grades on anything that they get. It's all feedback. Some of it's a lot of feedback if it's like they're a rough draft or they're conferencing with me. And I usually, when I give feedback on your final draft, I I just write like, here's what I see you did well, and here's what I suggest working on for next time. So I really want the revision, because of my field of composition, I want students to revise work that they're going to actually improve upon in their own view, and also to meet the requirements for the prompt or the thing we're looking at. So that is definitely something that took a while. I started off with just not grading the first couple papers, as I mentioned with the California Acceleration Project. I thought, okay, that's actually really good, because I noticed I would have a lot of students. One, I have a lot of students who are first generation. When I've taken informal surveys of, actually not informal, but formal surveys of my class, I found anywhere from 60 to 80% of the students were first in their family to go to college. And so I understand that that comes in, they have a lot of community cultural wealth, a lot of things they know, but they also need help with navigating higher ed. And so it could be really discouraging when you get your first paper back, and it has, you know, a C, a D, F, even a B, if you really felt like you did a great job and worked really hard. It may reinforce unknowingly for me the sense of not belonging in higher education. So I actually feel, to kind of respond to the concerns Stephanie talks about, it definitely takes a while. Students do feel it's harder when you're having them like develop their own criteria. I have them develop their own criteria. Certain aspects I have them design of the assignment, and that again, I use different scaffolds because I don't want to throw everything at them right away, because again, that could be also very overwhelming for students. And I also know that English, math is one of those kind of gatekeeper courses, unfortunately, for community college for higher ed. So I don't want to be too overwhelming. That's really important. And I want it to be really engaging and challenging and meaningful for them. So I definitely have had to kind of work against that resistance. Some of it I understand is students were like, just tell me my grade, that's what I want to know. But also, okay, wait, we have to develop our own criteria. I don't understand this. What, isn't that your job? So there's lots of conversations that I've had with students, although now I feel like, well, now I know I do survey them a couple times throughout the course, but I know that they're responding, and I also see, of course, my outcomes for the course in terms of success and retention. So that's really, really key. Early on, is especially like in my online courses, just asking them like, how is the grading going? What do you understand about the grade? What's confusing? What do you wish were different? Things like that. So I hope that kind of responds, but again, I didn't want to speak too much just from my own experience, because I understand not everybody here is within English composition. So I'm happy to talk about that more at length too. But I want to get us to page 10. And there's a couple different documents. One is new and one is taken from the podcast by Susan Bloom. And I'm just going to invite you to read through two selections, the two selections below. And if you need to go back and reread anything in the 5 minutes or so, that's fine. And I encourage you to do that. And imagine ways to ungrade at least one thing in your grading policy or syllabus. So I really suggest, I always encourage, take the jump, go for it. But if you're feeling like this is new, think about, again, for me, the reason I mentioned I started with just ungrading my first couple of assignments is because I noticed I would lose a lot of students in those first 2 to 3 weeks. So I thought, what happens if I don't grade their work? I give them feedback. What if I just don't grade it, right? Like, just do it. That's what because I kind of just want you to do it. I want you to do it so I can see your writing, so I can understand how you view yourself as a writer, and your relationship to literacy and writing. That's always one of my first assignments for a 1A. And, really, I would see in my own experience, but also the research bears that out, that really helps at the first part of the class, that you're expected to turn in the work, but you're not going to be graded for it. So I had a question, what happens with the students that don't turn in those first papers? Well, I get after them, but I think this is, anyway, uses the term ecology. He says, you know, your classroom ecology, how it connects with other things. So I think this is where the rethinking like late work policies and things like that, because you, and again, this is, I'm happy to talk about this more at length, but I try to design with an understanding of the student and thinking, I want to give them opportunities. I want to be fair to myself and my grading load and my reading load, but I also want to give them opportunities to demonstrate their learning in a lot of different ways. But I have to say with those first papers, you know, maybe all but one will turn them in. So that's typically not too much of an issue at this point. It tends to be maybe as we get a little later. And I know with the pandemic, I just kind of threw out my late work policy, and that's how one of the ways I adapted, and it was really helpful for students. And although I wasn't completely pleased with the success in terms of how many students stayed in the course, I was happier than I think I would have been if I would have been really strict about my initial late work policies, which are lenient. So let's take about 10 minutes, and I'm going to ask for you to do two things. Read those two selections. And again, one is from a really great website that talks about the syllabus and making it accessible in a lot of different ways, but I'm just taking from their policy page. And then two, on your own. So there's no space here, but just on your own, maybe on a separate document, imagine ways to ungrade at least one thing in your grading policy or syllabus in order to encourage student learning and success. If possible, review your own syllabus, specifically your grading policy and breakdown while you're doing this. So you can kind of take a look, is there something that you could ungrade in your class? So we're going to take about 10 minutes and then we'll come back together as a group. All right, we have a few minutes left, and so I invite you to share just some of your initial thoughts. The accessible syllabus website is just fantastic. I've really appreciated that website's approach to how to better design your syllabus so that it is accessible, not just in terms of readability, but also helping students understand what your expectations are, different ways to think about grading policy or the use of images, or kind of cutting down even on having 15, 20 page syllabi, which I am at 11 pages, so I'm still trying to cut that down. But that's a really good website to take a look at later and has lots of examples. So what I would love to hear a couple of ideas of how you might approach it or your next steps. Again, this is a chance to kind of learn and practice. And so we're all in different spots. And so it might just be one step, or it might be adding something to an ungrading approach that you're already doing. So any volunteers? And Alyssa, I see your question in the chat. I was responding on the chat there. Anyway, uses labor logs. He asks students to log like a timesheet, their labor. I have used that approach, but more recently with what I was mentioning in the chat is that in the pandemic, I felt it would be really hard for my students, knowing that many of them were already working jobs, but now working additional labor or taking on additional jobs, but also the difficulty of, many people at once using a computer or that kind of thing. So I moved away from that this term and instead used weekly reflections and built in the labor. So the question was, into my prompt, my step-by-step, like my process that I include in my prompts. So I typically will include a range. It's not, I just think about like how much class time I might use to do that, and just in my own experience. And I'm happy to share that document, Alyssa, if you, a couple examples, if you'd like me to share that with you. So just email me and I'm happy to share those ideas. But I have a hard time thinking of like exactly how I decide on how many hours it might take for students to do a particular step of a process. All right, so anyone, sorry, I wanted to respond to that chat. Any ideas that anybody would like to share?
I can share a beginning of an idea.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay. I was just, it's also, I'm still processing everything, but I was just thinking that, you know, especially for the first essays, I often share like student samples, and we go over kind of creating, using the rubric about what does that student do well, what suggestions would you give that student. So that could be a good bridge, like kind of looking at what I'm already doing and how could I modify that to, instead of me giving them the rubric, we could be creating the rubric from that activity. So that's just kind of my starting place of like, I don't have to completely scrap everything. It's just sort of like what is already working and how could I modify that to give them even more agency and metacognition.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing that. And also, I mean, I will sometimes bring in the SLOs, you know, for that process. So then, like, how will we take this assignment and then the SLO, and like you can put it, because I mean, our SLOs are not totally student friendly in terms of how they're written. But I think that's really helpful to kind of understand that. But yeah, thank you, Nicole. I definitely don't advocate scrapping everything unless I think that's very tough. But if you those like small incremental steps are so important. Yeah, thank you for sharing. And that's actually a big step of the thing.
All right, everyone. I hate to break up the party, but unfortunately, we have another session that's actually supposed to start right this moment. So I'm going to go ahead and paste. We are going to be having, oops, this is not the right document. Okay. We are going to be having another session coming up on, like, coming up very soon. And
can we just stay in this room?
we can't stay in this room because someone else is coming into this room.
Okay.
I know, but we can put you in another room if you all would like. So you let me know. You want me to give you another option?
Well, no, that's okay. I have Jennifer's contact information, so thank you, Jennifer. This has been a great session.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining. Yeah, there's a spot for final thoughts. And if anybody wants to stay, if you want to put there, and I'll hang out there a few minutes in another Zoom room. And also the information for the next one in the series, talking about it with colleagues. So that's a whole other thing. So yeah, thank you very much. Thank you everybody for sharing and for engaging in this work.
Hold on just one moment. Let me get that other. It starts doing that reCAPTCHA like excitement in there, and I'm just like, I don't have time for reCAPTCHA right now. So let me give you those. All right. And then we will be having another one, not this coming Friday because that's a holiday, but the Friday after will be a really great opportunity to talk about talking with your colleagues about ungrading, which is a hot topic. So let me just get this for you real quick.
I'm thinking I haven't done rubrics for discussion boards, but that might be maybe something where the class helps to create that and then maybe do the rubric for the discussion board as a starting point.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see how students think like they should be assessed on their participation.
All right, there is the room, folks. Enjoy. Take care.
Over there.
Bye-bye.
Okay.